Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today I have a special guest, Brian Campbell, better known as BC, co-founder of Mosaic. I usually have external guests, but today I have the pleasure of talking to BC. BC, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Cool. Well, before we get going, usually it's a mystery to me, but today I kind of know the backstory. But before we get going, for everyone else listening, do you mind giving everyone a quick background about yourself, past roles, how you ended up starting Mosaic with Bij and Joe, all that kind of stuff?
Sure, yeah. In college, I started a company, got into Y Combinator. That started the founder bug for me. And then I went to Palantir, and that's where I met Bij and Joe. And we were on the finance team, fast-growing business there, and just really were overwhelmed. So kind of took immediately a kind of like data process automation approach and learned a lot in that process, kind of automated a lot of what finance was doing. And then we started to be more strategic in that role. And I think that's where the whole vision of kind of how to approach finance from a data first perspective and how to be more strategic with the business kind of came from. But we didn't really put that all together. It's when we left, each of us went to be, lead finance teams at different VC-backed companies, where we immediately were back in Excel, Google Sheets, and realized like, okay, wow, all the stuff we did there, every kind of finance team needs that. And that's where we kind of put the dots together and we're like, okay, we can make a product that actually does this, efficiently.
Love it. I know from what I've heard about the story is like, you were all three of you finance guys, but you were the technical one. Joe always defers to you as like, all right, BC was the one putting all the data together. And that's why I wanted to have you on today, because we were going to talk about the mess of information that can be SaaS billing data. And I know that you have been kind of like up against this for a little bit with our data team. Shout out to Caleb. Caleb, if you listen to this, hello. But do you mind walking us through sort of the challenges you've seen on the SaaS billing data side as far as like what you're saying, what Mosaic's vision is and what we need to deal with there?
Yeah, definitely. So, the billing systems, and we're talking, Stripe, ChargeBee, SaaS Optics, whatever it is. Obviously, the billing data is crucial to any finance business, both for the direct, what it actually represents, how much you're invoicing and typically what you're collecting. But also that's usually the source for a lot of these companies of what is your MRR, what is your ARR, kind of all these derived SaaS metrics, what is your customer count, et cetera. And so the problem with these tools is they are generally massive, like huge transaction volume. The thing you're trying to get out of it, MRR, is not just in there. It doesn't exist. It's like how much you invoiced and you have discounts, prorations, all these complexities. And the data volume is really high. So a lot of customers are struggling with, how do I take all this Stripe data and make sense of it from a MRR SaaS metric perspective? And it's just a complex problem. There's a lot of data volume. These systems are rigid. So anyways, we'll dive more into that the rest of this podcast, but it's a tough problem for sure.
Yeah, I think one question I have is whether, I know in the past, like in the background, you and I talked a lot about Stripe, but good to know that that's also like a problem for other billing systems as well. And the one point of clarification I want to make, because we've done an episode and we've done content about CRM hygiene, and like this feels very similar. Like we talked about like making your CRM, your Salesforce, your HubSpot, like a source of truth for revenue data. And so I think I've heard you talk about this a little bit, but can you just talk about like the audience for this particular problem? Like what kind of company is using Stripe as the source of revenue truth rather than like a Salesforce or a HubSpot?
Yeah, definitely. So typically more B2C, so business to consumer. And it's generally like very high data volume, like self-serve product-led growth companies. People are just signing up online for the cheap plan or whatever, versus kind of enterprise contracts. You have a sales team, they're using Salesforce, they're signing these larger contracts. And so, B2C or kind of product-led growth where people can self-serve sign up and kind of automate that process is phenomenal for a lot of reasons. The issue you get into though is, one, tremendous data volume because it's just happening all the time. And then two, billing systems are relatively rigid, right? They're structured. You can't do too much with them. You can't go really change historicals because they're kind of customer facing, right? So like the customer sees the invoice and they see this stuff. You can't just change it. Whereas on Salesforce, customers never see that, right? You can put whatever you want in Salesforce. You can go back and change it from 2 years ago or do whatever. Like you're kind of in full control in some sense. For better or worse, there's definitely pros and cons to that. But the issue with this billing side is you don't always have that control, and the volume's so high that it's, even if you could go back and change it, it's just too much data to clean up anyways.
Yeah, I remember we were talking to, I think it was Jason Peretz at Galley, and he was talking about just like the being inundated with data cleanup for the CRM. And he was like, we only have like 200 contracts, like historically, for me to go through. And it's just like a whole different animal if we're talking about a Stripe or, like you said, a product-led growth. So I just wanted to make sure that was like front and center as a point of comparison. But I do want to talk, I mean, we're going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of dealing with all that data. But I'm curious, like, to start off, I know a big part of the project is like, there are tools like there's the Profit Wells, there's the Chart Moguls, there's the Barometrics of the world that will help companies make sense of this data. So like give them better charting or improve upon like the internal dashboarding of Stripe. So can you just talk a little bit about that relationship? Like when you might decide to use a profit well instead of the internal dashboarding there. And we'll get into maybe some of the downsides of that, but I'm curious like what that step up is, what that progression looks like.
Yeah, so ChartMogul, ProfitWell, Barometrics, those are all great companies. And when you first get started on a billing system like Stripe or ChargeBeat, they're great tools. And the reason they exist is because Stripe isn't like an MRR tool, right? It's a billing tool, right? But everyone knows that it's like, hey, you want to get your MRR out of it. So those tools pop up, connect your Stripe to it or ChargeBeat, and we will kind of create all these SaaS metrics and things. And so they're great for that purpose. And they work kind of out of the box. They're easy to set up and get going, but you kind of get what you get out of them, right? You don't have that much control over it. For the most part, they're fairly accurate when you're getting started. And they're good for like little dashboards to kind of get a sense of what's going on. I think more recently, ChargeBee and Stripe are aware that customers want this data. And so they started building a little bit more inside the tooling. So I know Stripe now has like an MRR thing you can get out of it. But it's not that detailed, right? It's like a by month, by customer kind of report, and you don't have a lot of control over it. And a lot of times it doesn't really make sense, or you're like, where are these numbers coming from? And so I think with some of these other tools, you get a little bit more detail, but even then they're still not exactly what you want. I mean, they're out of the box tools that they're easy to set up, but they're not that customizable.
Yeah, I'm thinking like the range of options you have here, like something like these tools are, I think in many cases free to an extent, or like, pretty cheap on a month-to-month basis. Or like the far end is like, I don't know, like an Anaplan or Adaptive, like something that you've implemented like way in like kind of legacy 2.0. And it's like, those are like tens of thousands of dollars, like maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars just to put in place. Like, what is sort of like the context that you can get? Like, at what point do you sort of outgrow the, this is fine, I'm good with like a Barometrics or a Profit Well, and you have to start thinking about as a finance leader, hey, like this out of the box nature like isn't going to work for me here?
Yeah, good question. I think it comes down to granularity, data volume, complexity of what's going on in your business. And so just to give you an example, we've had customers come to us that are using all of them. Like, here's our chart mogul, here's a profit well, here's Barometrics. And the reason they do that is to just kind of make sure they're getting the right answer, right? Everyone is a slightly different number. It's like, hey, they're off by 1,000 each month, but we know we're in the right ballpark, which on the one hand is, they're all directionally right. But on the other hand, you're kind of like, well, what is actually correct? You're like, which one do we want? And for different reasons, they make different, they're different advantages. But so I think when people come to us generally, or when they kind of outgrow these systems, are when they have a lot of just nuances to their business that just fit outside the mold of Chart Mogul or Barometrics, where they have some like referral program, there's lots of credits and this and that, and they want to treat them differently, and they're kind of not sitting in the mold that kind of comes out of the box. A lot of adjustments they want to make. A lot of these tools don't really make you do adjustments at scale. If they want to bring in different aspects of their business, so hey, we have product-led growth, that's great, it's all in Stripe. We've also now started selling enterprise, and we're invoicing out of some other tool, or it's all in Salesforce. And now you don't want to just go to the different places and put them together yourself. You want one place you can go. It's all centralized. You can drill down, you can filter, you can show your numbers kind of all in one place, right? So those are the big ones. Also, if you want to just add data from different systems together, right? So you have, Stripe data, and maybe some of those Stripe invoices are actually from Salesforce customers, and you want to bring in that Salesforce data, right? So what is the customer name in Salesforce? Who's the sales rep that sold the deal? Kind of join all that stuff together. You can't really do in these other systems very well. So, a lot of different reasons to move on. I would say another one, just to throw it out there, is just granularity of data, right?
Yeah.
When you go to Stripe and you look at the Stripe out of the box MRR, it's just going to show you a number by month per customer. Well, that customer might have multiple products. They might have multiple invoices, like discounts happening, and really being able to understand, okay, well, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? You can't do that in these tools very well. And so Mosaic lets you really drill into exactly what's going on.
I have something. By the time this airs, it will be public knowledge, but congrats to you and the founding team. We just raised a Series C. So, not today, but when this is live, it'll be
Thanks.
public knowledge. And so part of that project is something we're working on in the background. We're working on like a due diligence checklist for our customers and for our prospects as like, hey, here's the things like we needed to dig into for our investors, like as we were raising this round. And so the points you make about granularity are, really resonate with me because I just finished writing this thing and it was all about like, no one just wants to hear your, your net retention or your ARR. It's like everything that I heard from Joe G, other co-founder, was, I want ARR by customer. I want top 10 contracts. Like all of that granularity needs to be there. And I'm curious, like as a follow-up, is that granularity demand mainly in these stages, maybe like in a, obviously maybe like pre-series D? Is it mostly driven by investors asking for things? Or how does it impact sort of like the day-to-day of actually trying to plan your business?
Yeah, I think it's the granularity, I think, comes into play, especially from these billing systems of just trust. There's like so much data that people just don't trust. And the kind of the ironic nature that they're in is like people in the business, like the sales reps or the support people, kind of know specific customers. And so they'll look at whatever you're spitting out and be like, that customer's wrong, right? And it's like one of thousands of customers. And you're like, this is really frustrating because every data point that people have, there's like, oh, this is wrong, that's wrong. And they're kind of pointing out all these edge cases, even if in the aggregate you're mostly directionally right. And so I think that's where the frustrating place comes in with all these other tools. Where we're like, hey, this customer's wrong, that customer's wrong. And then you start to lose trust in the overall number, even if it's actually directionally right. And so, I think it really comes a lot from internal the business where people start to feel like, hey, we have questions around customers, like this cohort of customer or this new product initiative, or we feel like there's customers gaming the system, or we have like a referral problem, or whatever. And so people start to dig into it, and then that's when you really want the ability to get in and actually get granular in terms of specific invoices, credit memos, refunds, how those are all being folded in. Because again, each business is different. Some treat refunds and credit memos very differently than other businesses. So you want to be able to kind of, based on how your business operates, make sure that the data is reflecting that. So I think it's more internal. And actually, one of the things we see often with Mosaic when we set up the Mosaic and they're looking at their Stripe or ChargeBee data, is they start to like uncover a little bit more than they realized, right? So they kind of have this intuition of things happening, but they don't really know the supporting data. And now it's like, oh yeah, these are the 50 customers that are in this bucket of issue or whatever, right? And so I think we start to actually the first couple months or even couple weeks of the Mosaic data experience is like really kind of exploring your data in a way that you hadn't been able to before, and really getting down to a detail of like, okay, let me get down to this invoice, and then I'll go open the invoice up in Stripe and look at it and be like, oh yeah, that's really weird. Why did that happen? Or like, we should change something about our process to make sure we're not missing invoices every month or whatever. So to me, that's always like a satisfying thing. It's always weird, but it's satisfying when people kind of really start to understand their data, and it impacts how they communicate to the business, or what they show in their metrics or whatever it is.
Totally. Obviously, like it's kind of a leading question because some of my favorite questions on this podcast are when I hear anyone with finance background talk about some of that collaboration aspect, and we'll get more into that. But I know that a lot of this comes down to like, well, my investor asked for, like, we did a whole episode with Joel from Amper about like ad hoc analysis. It's just all about like the random requests in the morning that he'll get, especially when they were like raising their Series A. And so, cool to hear that it's not just, hey, I'm on this kind of like treadmill of requests. Like it's really, once you make sense of this, it's really beneficial to like the internal operations of the business. So all of that, like everything we've kind of talked about, you've mentioned a few examples of where you want that granularity. I want to spend some time like in the weeds. And I know that is where you have been with this issue for a while. And I want to hear a little bit about the framework that you all have set up to sort of make sense of Stripe data. So we've realized we need the precision, we need the granularity. And now I've, got Mosaic and I'm going to hook up my Stripe data. How do we go about like giving that level of granularity? Obviously, don't want to give away any secret sauce here, but as much as you could tell me about making sense of that data.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in general, once you connect your Stripe data through the API, we suck in kind of all the invoice line details, subscription items. We pull everything in. And for MRR specifically, kind of the revenue SaaS metric data set specifically, we do everything at an invoice line item level, right? So for all the historical data, we're looking on every single invoice, every single proration line, what's the amount, what's the quantity, are there discounts included? Like all of that is factored in. And so you have this really rich bottoms up, every detail for all of your historical data. We then factor in, credit memos, refunds. We look at time zones, and everything's down to the second, just the way Stripe does everything down to the millisecond. So everything ties out. And then for the current month will switch from using invoice data to using the current subscription data, right? And so as subscriptions are actually kind of actively changing, Stripe isn't invoicing every second, like it's just kind of building up these changes. So you get a slightly more kind of up to date view of your current month subscriptions. And so you kind of put all those together and you get your entire kind of history of Stripe data in a really accessible, easy to slice and dice kind of drill into way, for any given customer in a given month, get down to the invoices, get down to the line items, whatever you want to do. And that's the starting point. So you connect your Stripe data, that kind of happens a little bit more out of the box. And then from there, that's when it starts to get interesting of like, okay, well, yeah, that's kind of in the same ballpark as Baremetrics or ChartMogul, but this is what we want to start doing. Or as they start exploring their data, they start realizing like, hey, this feels weird. We want to do something there. And that's when you get into the really specifics of, okay, well, here's Stripe. Now we want to join it onto, we have custom fields in Stripe. Great. Let's enable those. Let's join it onto Salesforce data, or let's take some other invoicing data and bring it in and kind of union them together via CSV upload or Salesforce data or wherever. We have customers that use Stripe and ChargeBee together. So like, whatever it is, like let's bring it all together in one place so that you have one place. All your metrics are, show your complete picture and you can drill in from there. The nuance though, like where you can really get into precision is once customers start getting in there, they know some of the issues they have, right? So it's like, hey, we have scenario, and we've seen this with customers where I just love this example because I found it so funny, but it was like, they had customers gaming their system where they would do all these referrals to themselves almost. And so they would get all these free credits and they would just perpetually use this product for free, right? And they kind of knew it was a problem, but it's hard to identify because they had so many users. And so they wanted specific. And so for ChartMogul and all these other tools, it was showing as MRR, right? It was like, hey, these customers have MRR. They're not paying anything because it's credited out, but they're, they have these invoices every month and they get credited and all that stuff. And so they wanted some specific logic that was like, okay, only counted if a customer's actually paid, right? So just little things like that can go a long way. Or they had, scenarios where customers were like kind of going away and coming back like month over month, and they had this weird like spiky behavior in their data, and we can help resolve some of that. So, there's always something new to it, honestly. And I say that in the Mosaic can actually help and rectify and kind of get the data right. At the same time, though, there is always that gray area of there's a lot of data volume. The reality is like some of it's going to be immaterial. At a certain point, it's going to be like not a big deal. And it's like, you got to kind of look the bigger picture and be like, hey, is it worth your time as a finance person who's usually strapped and there's a million other things to do, like to get, every tiny little detail right? Or is it like, hey, the nature of business, you're going to have some nuance there, some volatility, some imperfection in the data. And so that's always something a customer has to kind of decide for themselves, like where they want to draw the line. But, I think we can help get you there in a way that most other tools can't.
Yeah, I love the story. I mean, apologies to any of those people that were gaming the system and saving a bunch of money. I'm sorry that we are responsible for ending that loophole for you, but it's a really cool story. And I know we had talked about it briefly, like as we were kind of preparing to do this, and I was excited to hear more about it. So I love that. I think something that I want to follow up on is like, you've mentioned a few times, like you've mentioned credit memos, you've mentioned refunds. In that story, you mentioned like kind of getting to the granularity of like when they actually paid to record things. So like those all sound like sort of levers or variables that Mosaic can like include or handle to customize the way you analyze or report Stripe data. I'm curious, like, can you give me like the full or like the list of key variables that you would consider common ways to sort of tweak or customize that billing data?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, the one that's always out of the box is like, do you want to include discounts or not, right? So like you have one-time discounts, repeating discounts or forever discounts, and people want to treat those differently. There's definitely times people want to have their MRRs like includes a discount, and maybe they have like a gross MRR that includes without any discount. So there's flexibility in terms of how we want to do that. We've definitely had customers where like segments of their Stripe data they knew was bad, and so we would just kind of filter it out and then bring that data in from somewhere else that they trusted or had a clean file of it, whatever. So it really kind of depends on the business of exactly what they want to do, I guess. We've had customers where we pull out refunds automatically, and same with credit notes. But we've had customers where how they were using credit notes was just not. They knew it was different, and they were like, "We do this weird thing." It was like, "Okay, well, yeah, obviously we'll change it up for you guys." And so some of that's just conversation, and some customers know that coming to us like right away. They're like, "Here's Stripe data. We do X, Y, and Z weird." There's other times where as we're going through it and drilling in and kind of validating the data looks good, they're like, "Hey, these are weird. These are weird." And sometimes they didn't really even know that before. They just, as they're investigating it, they're like, "Hey, these look weird." And then we start to kind of have a conversation with them around what they need to do or what we should do for them. So, and sometimes it is just, hey, process on their end. Like,
Yeah.
we should just change our process or start doing something, tagging something a little differently. And sometimes it's, hey, let's just do something on our end to just filter them out or change them up or whatever, how they're treated. So it just kind of depends on a customer by customer basis. But I think that's the level of kind of customization you get with Mosaic, working with our data team to actually get in there and figure it out.
Yeah, I would love to, if possible, go through maybe another example beyond the gaming the system one, although that one is fun. Because to me, the way it sounds, and obviously not a finance guy, so trying to make sense of it all on my end as well. It's almost like you get a triangle of like MRR numbers. Like Stripe says one thing, and then you hook it up to, insert your favorite subscription management tool here, and they'll show you a slightly different MRR number, and you're like, okay. And then Mosaic is like another slightly different one. So you have this triangle, and our goal when you come in as a customer is to make sense of why those changes are different and why, or how to get it to the most precise number that we can. And that's kind of everything that you've talked about is like going through that. It just feels very abstract to me. So I'm curious if you can like walk me through an example of like customer A comes in, they're dealing with this Stripe problem that we've seen a bunch, and here's what we're going to do. And here's, how we fix it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess another example I'll give is most tools, and Mosaic included, by the way, you kind of choose like, hey, do I want to include discounts or not in my MRR or certain discounts, right? And when you say yes or no, whatever, the MRR you start to see is based on those discounts or not, right? So it's kind of factored in, and that's what you get, and everything else is built off of that. And so we had a customer come to us and say, that's great. I want my MRR to, not include these discounts, but I also want the discounts to kind of show up as like extra line items so that when I'm looking at my MRR total, the discounts are included, but it's a separate object I can filter out on the fly. So it's not like kind of pre-filtered out at the beginning of creating your kind of data. It's something they can kind of toggle on or off downstream, just in the nature of kind of what discounts meant to their business. So, that was something you can't really do in other tools. You kind of pre-configure it. You say, do you include them? Yes or no? And that's it, And so in Mosaic, we were able to actually have it so that it was built in a way that they can filter it out or show how much was discounts versus how much was not. And I think that was, we hadn't done that before. And so it was kind of a fun little project to do. And, we try to, not always dive into doing custom stuff, but, where needed, if it's important to the business, we can do it. So that's, I guess, another use case that was pretty abnormal.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think as I do more and more of these episodes, I mean, I've been at Mosaic for a couple of years, and this is like, I think you'll be episode 37 of the podcast, but I spend a lot of time talking to finance people, and it seems like every time, regardless of the topic, it's like there's always strange use cases. Like there's like almost nothing standard about the workflows that go on in the day in life of someone in a finance leadership position, even though it's like cyclical for workflows, but like, man, every company's so different. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, we've had other customers come to us where, they had Stripe data and they were doing kind of their own logic in Excel or something. And, they had just a lot of volatility of like, it was like very usage based. So up and down every month. And it was just too noisy. Like they couldn't show it to investors. It was just all over the place. And so they started using, their MRR was like a rolling average for each customer kind of thing of like, hey, what the MRR should be, just to get this like smoother experience that was still like relative value. So that, there's always something. You always want your business to be simple and out of the box and everything just works. But, the reality is either you're complex to begin with, or as you scale, you become complex. So you need to do something.
Totally. Well, I appreciate you sort of getting in the weeds with me. I hope it's helpful for people because, I know it's a big problem for customers that come in and want to use any of these tools, not just Mosaic, but even the chart moguls. Like as soon as you start using one, it's like, okay, it's good, but it's not perfect. And every tool seems good, but not perfect until you figure it out. So I appreciate that. But I want to zoom out a little bit. It'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this because we are the strategic finance company. So zooming out, I want to talk about what it means for, someone in your past positions of finance leadership. Like, great, I have, Mosaic. They've made sense of my Stripe data where before I didn't have that granularity. What do I get as a benefit? What am I able to do? What insights can I get from this data that I couldn't before? Really curious, like how this impacts the day to day.
Yeah. So I think the big thing is really building trust and confidence,
Yeah.
right? So whenever you're using these tools, a lot of these other ones out there, it's kind of very customer level. You don't have the granularity to like really, you get these like dashboards, right? So kind of like pre-baked dashboards, and you can filter on a few things, but you really can't explore the data in the way that you want to, right? And that exploration over time really builds trust and confidence, both knowing that when ad hoc things come up, CEO, investor, whatever, oh yeah, I can dive in and know where to go. But I know that the data is going to be there. But also just as you start doing that, again, you start to just learn about your data in a way that you don't explore. I mean, finance people are great at pivot tables and Excel, right? So you're like, that exploration though, if you don't have it, you kind of just, every time you go into Barometrics or ChartMogul or Stripe, you come into something new and you're like, that's weird, or that's not right, or why is this customer zero, or why is this customer showing MRR? They haven't paid us ever. You always run into these weird things. And I think and you do them like one off because there's no really way to explore with ease. So I think with Mosaic, the big thing is all of your data, all your metrics are coming off this Stripe data that's really granular. And so you can, from your net retention, from your customer count, whatever, you can start really drilling into the details and kind of get into the weeds of the Stripe data behind the scenes. And I think you build confidence and trust in the numbers. And so you can focus less on like every month, what are the numbers, and focus a little bit more on like, hey, let's just dive into what it means, or dive into the updating, or dive into the other stuff that I need to do.
The dream for every finance person is to not spend all of their time just digging in, aggregating data. So appreciate that. I think it makes sense. I want to, we've talked a lot about, or we've mentioned a lot of specific tools, and I want to get away from the sort of subscription management space. So not talking about ChartMogul, ProfitWell, Barometrics, things like that. But we've kind of used Stripe as the de facto. I know you've mentioned ChargeBee as well, but I've gotten a lot of questions in the past about just like choosing billing systems. I know you said these are really rigid, so I'm curious, like, do you have any tips for people to evaluate billing systems? Should they consider this sort of data conversation that we're having as part of it, or is that agnostic to tools? Just curious, like, what your thoughts are. I know you've implemented your share of billing tools in the past, so would love any advice here.
Yes, good question. So I'd say when we talk about billing systems at Mosaic, the big ones we see most often are Stripe, ChargeBee, Ordway, and SaaS Optics, which is now Maxio, I think. And so those are the big four. You also have like Zoho subscriptions. There's a long tail of other things out there. You can use like Bill.com, I'm sure, and other things. But those are the big four that we generally see. And they are very different in terms of what you're looking for. The first thing I would say, even before kind of diving into them, is like understand what you're actually buying, right? So like ChargeBee and Stripe, there's all kinds of different add-ons. Like, are you just payment processing? Are you actually the billing? Do you bring out subscription management, reporting? There's all kinds of different bundles you can buy, which change what you get and also the price you pay. But I would say, there's a reason we talk about Stripe. They're kind of the de facto in the market for product-led growth, very API-driven, a lot of documentation, a lot of experience. I mean, people complain all the time, but for the most part, they're very good what they do. It is very rigid, but if you have kind of a website where you can sign up and buy stuff and it's fully automated, you have usage-based stuff in your product, like Stripe is great, right? There's a reason they're kind of the standard, but they are fairly rigid and fairly simple as well. I would say ChargeBee, also very good APIs. Both of them are very good for like high data volume, relatively simple invoicing structure. I think ChargeBee gives you a little bit more control or better experience from the UI perspective, being able to log in, create invoices, send them out, customize them a little bit. And so we've had customers use Stripe for user-based kind of self-serve, and then ChargeBee for like enterprise invoicing, just as like a subtle example there. You could obviously use all of them for anything. And then I would say moving on into Ordway. Ordway is a newer player in the market, I think a little bit smaller, but they have really good APIs. So also, hooking your product and all that stuff. I'd say where Ordway sets themselves apart from the other two is you can do really complex subscription management. So you can do all kinds of funky stuff, upsells, changes. So if you're trying to automate like enterprise sales with like selling to hospitals and all kinds of different things and whatever happening, both their APIs and their UI, you can do really complex stuff. Obviously, they can do the simple stuff well too, but I know for businesses that have more complexity, Ordway is becoming more popular. And then SaaS Optics is kind of the older player in the market. They're not great on the API front necessarily, but if you're doing like Salesforce enterprise sales with like, you have multi-year contracts and step ups, and it's a little bit more manual. A lot of people like SaaS Optics just because you can really customize it. And one of the things SaaS Optics as well that the others don't do well, at least from a finance person's perspective, is it lets you literally set what the MRR is. Like this contract from this day to this day, here's the MRR, here's the ARR. And so there's no like you're not deriving numbers, you're not like calculating what it is. It's just that's what it is. And so if you do more like enterprise contracts and not super high volume, SaaS Optics might be a good option there. But I think most of the people we talk to on the B2C, it's like Stripe, ChargeBee, or Ordway are the three that they're looking at.
Yeah, that's such an awesome overview. Really appreciate you kind of giving the pluses for each one. I know you said Ordway is kind of the newer one in the space. I remember we did a podcast or a webinar, and Brian Weisberg, shout out Brian Weisberg, been on the podcast twice, great customer of Mosaic, but I know he has become like diehard Ordway fan. Like he was singing the praises, and probably for that exact reason is the complexity that he is dealing with on sort of like the contract side is probably why he likes it so much. So appreciate that overview. It's a really good one. But
I will say all the customers I do have that are Ordway users, like they love Ordway. Like so it's like
all right,
pretty
go
funny
Ordway
to see that.
Well, congrats to Ordway, I guess. I mean, I know we like Ordway internally, but building a product people love, that's great. And for billing systems, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of complaining about billing systems, just the concept of it in general. So if you can build a lovable billing system, I mean, more power to you. That's amazing. Anything, the only other thing I'll follow up with on the tool side, I'm curious if you have any is there any pitfalls to avoid? I know we talked a lot about the data setup, and maybe they're all complicated in their own ways, or there's really no avoiding this kind of not issue, but the conversation that we're having now about kind of making sense of all that data. Are there pitfalls in general of searching for a billing system, ways that you can get caught up with the wrong one? I know you mentioned kind of knowing what you're paying for. Curious if there's anything else.
Honestly, you're not going to go that wrong if you use Stripe, ChargeBee, or Ordway. To be honest, you're going to be fine in the end. There's a reason, Stripe is the market leader, but there's also reasons like Ordway exists, right? It wasn't solving all the problems, and people have different needs on the billing front. So, the biggest thing you do is just ask around and try to ask what they're good at, what they're not, and really try to hopefully see a little into the future in terms of what your business needs, right? If you're selling relatively simple 1 or 2, 3 plans, high volume, Stripe probably is the place for you, right? So kind of understanding where you fit into there is going to be important to it. I would say in general for billing systems though, no matter what you use, they're going to be relatively rigid. The data is never going to be perfect at the end. So one of the things you can do is whatever you choose to do, just make sure you're looking at that data as much as possible, either directly or with Barometrics or Mogul or someone like Mosaic, because it's going to add up very quickly. And then you don't want to look back over a year or two and be like, wow, our data is a total mess. Hey, and some of that is just process, right? Like how are you tagging stuff in the system, working within the confines of whatever tool you're using, but just doing it as well as you can do it. That's probably the biggest thing. And so I think one of the best ways to make sure that you're entering the data correctly is by looking at the outputs and just making sure you're setting yourself up for success over the next couple of years.
I feel like I could have changed the name of this podcast to just garbage in, garbage out. I feel like almost every time I'm coming toward the end of the topic, I'm like, all right, what can we learn? And it's almost always like, hey, make sure you have clean data. Make sure you're starting with the foundation. And so, I mean, we talk a lot about setting up that process. I mean, this whole episode was about the process of sort of making sense of billing data. So appreciate that it kind of sums up with that. And yet we are the roll forward. So no garbage in, garbage out podcast, but maybe somebody else can run with that if they want to. All right, BC, I have 2 more higher level questions. So thank you for bearing with me as I sort of grill you on the specifics of all the work you've done on Stripe. I think there's a lot of really great information that you already laid out. But I'm curious, just high level, you've spent a bunch of time sort of building this framework, standardizing SaaS billing data to the extent that it can be so that it can go into Mosaic. I'm curious, what's one of the biggest takeaways that you've learned while diving deep into this problem of rigid billing data?
The biggest takeaway, I would say, counter to what I just said about garbage in, garbage out is it's never going to be perfect. it's just not going to be perfect, and you're not going to be able to change it. And so because of the data volume or because the system's too rigid, like there is going to be some imperfection in your data. And obviously the reason you want to look at your data as soon as you start using the tool is to make sure that you're kind of setting yourself up for, hey, the processes where the data tagging is as good as it can be early on. But even then, there's something's going to happen. You're going to have edge cases. And so a company like Mosaic, we can help you kind of clean up some of that. But even still, there's, with enough data volume, with enough data complexity, there's still going to be some imperfections of the data. And I think finance people, as they start drilling into it, as they're looking at it, when they see it and they know it's wrong, it's infuriating. Like you just like, you have to get it right. And so I think that, to me, one of the big things I've seen with certain customers is like, they kind of start going down a rabbit hole, and it could be a little bit too much, where it's like, hey, is this really material at this point? Where they, you know, they have hundreds of customers, and it's like, okay, one or two customers are off this month. It's like, okay, but their volatility every month is all over the place. So I think for me, that's one of the big things of, you know, as people really start looking into their data, we clean up more of it, we get it into a better state, but sometimes there's always still something else, right? And at a certain point, you're like, hey, you know, is that the best use of time? And you know, I've seen it so much, it's infuriating, you know, a little bit to, you know, whenever you see it, and you're like, oh man, I can tell they know it's wrong, or not even wrong, but just, it's not how they want their business to look, right? Like this customer, I don't want to look this way, even though it is that way. And so you're like, hey, you know, so that's always one of the things that I see finance people struggling with. And, you know, sometimes you have to help step back and be like, hey, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars or whatever. Like, we're really at a point where this is not worth anyone's time. And I think that with the billing data, it can be really frustrating just because the volume is so high. There's always something.
I think I kind of feel like the answer to this question I'm going to ask is just going to be like a big, it depends, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because why not? I'm curious, like you mentioned earlier about the same topic, like kind of knowing where to draw the line in the sand. And so you've done this work in multiple positions, like you're seeing it now with customers, like on the Mosaic side. Like, do you have a tip for deciding where to draw that line in the sand? Like, how do you know? Or is it kind of just a feel, like as your business grows and you just kind of have to make a judgment call? Curious if there's anything that you can look at to figure that out.
Yeah, it's totally a feel. There's no like there's no clear. That's part of the frustrating part, but there's no clear answer. But you know, it changes over time too, right? Like, so
sure.
When you're smaller, like, hey, it's got a tie. We have exactly 202 customers, whatever. Like, okay, absolutely. And then over time, it might be like, hey, we're talking thousands and thousands of customers. I don't care as much about some of the nuance there, right? I just want to make sure that there's no cohorts of customers slipping through in a way that I don't like, right? So you become more about these bigger patterns. So it's just totally on a customer basis, and it changes over time. So it's hard to say, but it's more of a balance of like, what is, as you're a finance person, what is your opportunity cost? Like, what else could you be doing to the business? And, you know, maybe you're about to fundraise money, and now is the right time to really care, and, you know, whatever. But like most of the time, it's not. So it totally depends.
Yeah, makes sense. Appreciate you adding some detail to it. I kind of figured it was going to be it depends, but I still think the detail was good, so I appreciate it. All right, last question. We ask everyone that comes on, BC, so appreciate you bearing with me again. But want to know, super high level, what's one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you started out in finance?
Okay, one kind of a joke. I thought accounting was more I thought accounting was like there was one right answer, it was black and white, and that's not true anymore. There's so much nuance to accounting that blew that. But you know, I'm not an accountant, so I won't dive into that. But no, I think for me, I'm a data guy. So, you know, part of the reason I got into finance was data and numbers, right? But I wish I knew earlier in finance that it was really about empowering the business with data. That is something like that, really being strategic and helping the business, as opposed to I'm just doing my job. Like in finance, I have a job to do. I report to the CEO, whatever. Like, you know, these are the things I need to do. Close the books every month, report, update. And obviously you do have to do that stuff. And that is your first primary responsibility. And so to me, though, you know, finance is uniquely situated to, once you've done your work, you're uniquely situated to actually help the business in a way that no other department can, right? Like marketing department is never going to be like, hey, customer success, let me analyze your data and like look at stuff together, or vice versa.
Can vouch for that. I will not do that for CS.
Yeah, but finance, right? So finance already is talking to every department, both for, you know, budgeting, which, you know, is what it is, but also for like, hey, I'm trying to build a report for the investors. Like, what have our leads generated every month? What have our customer acquisition costs. Like you're already communicating with every department with data, right? And so I think when I first started out, as a young professional, it was like, hey, I have my responsibilities. I need to prepare this deck. I need to get this data from a department, right? Or here's their budget. I need to sit down with them and have them review it and understand it. And that's it. And I think over time, finance has this access to data, which again, as a young professional was fun, exciting, but really how do you empower other business leaders with that? So you're not just kind of make it a two-way street, right? Where you're not just needing things from them for budgets or asking for their data so you can put it into a deck for investors or whatever, but really trying to make it a two-way street. And it's subtle, but it goes a long way. So it starts with automating a lot of your work. And so a tool like, Selfless Bug from Mosaic to like help you streamline some of your stuff so you can start to have more time to do things like this. So, in your first year or two at a startup, probably not. But after that, you can sit down with each department lead and just basically like, hey, what are the metrics you care about? Like, customer support tickets per customer, engineering, efficiency, or how much you're completing every sprint, whatever it is, right? So you can start to learn a little about that and start to, hey, how can I help you get more data? Or maybe we can look at for each customer support ticket, request, how much are each of those customers spending on us, right? So are you spending a lot of money on customers actually not giving you a lot of money back, right? In terms of time and everything else. So you can start to give them stuff. And even if it's really small, so when you're doing your budget updates with department leads, include their operational metrics in it, right? So like, hey, here's your numbers, here's our number, like here's your whole picture of the business, right? The reason you're spending money is so that your operational stuff is better. And it just starts to make the conversation more about strategically how their department is doing versus just here's your budget, right? It's like, okay, well, here's your support tickets this month, whatever. And so you have to be in a good enough relationship where they trust you to like, hey, you're pulling the right numbers. You don't want to ever show them numbers that they're like, these are my numbers and they're wrong. So you have to be at a place where everyone's aligned on, hey, these are the numbers, these are where they get them. And again, that's where Mosaic can come into play of like all that data is flowing into one place. Maybe it's going to your Snowflake database first and then it's going to Mosaic, but everyone's aligned on what those numbers are. So when you're showing them, it's not like it's not weird that they're seeing them from you, but you can start more talking about, hey, what is going on? Like, do you need to hire more people or what is the goal there? Or even when you're doing your forecast, right? Even if the ratio of customers to support reps is not an input to your model, even just having it as output. So when you're showing the forecast of the budget for the year, you can be like, hey, by the end of the year, by the way, this is your ratio of support tickets per customers, right? So those little things start to go a long way for different department leads to really trust finance and see finance as like, hey, they're thinking about us strategically. Like we're having a deeper conversation around the business. So yeah, early on, I didn't really know that. I see that now. Not every business is like that, by the way. I'm very transparent in terms of the approach. I think Mosaic we want people to be transparent. Certain businesses, it's up to the CEO, I guess, to some extent, but that's how I view the role of finance.
No, I love that. I think, fits in with everything that, Mosaic stands for. I think it fits in candidly with how you all run our business, how I feel when I work with you guys. I mean, I get to sit here and chat with you about this on a podcast for marketing. Like you could be off doing something else. Like there is a good relationship between finance, not just in the numbers, but I think in everything that we do. So I appreciate it. So love that answer. I think coming up, we're at the end of time. So just want to say I appreciate you taking the time in the day to do this. I think there's a lot of great information here, but the floor is kind of yours here. Anything that you want to plug, anything you're excited about that's coming up, where can people connect with you? The floor is yours to pitch whatever you would like. Usually this is like a customer or like somebody external. We kind of pitch Mosaic all the time, but you can if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess super excited to share that we got our Series C. Yeah. That'll be out there at this point in time. Really excited about what that's going to mean for Mosaic. We've got a really high-powered engineering team right now cranking out a lot of really awesome stuff to make the app more flexible and more just kind of configurable to every company, every nuance that they care about. And that's just going to add to that. And we're also going to start layering in a little AI, ChatGPT, all that stuff is exciting time. So, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to, help out finance with that, kind of embedding that into a product like Mosaic. So just really excited about the future, what's coming. And yeah, that's all I got.
Sweet. Well, BC, thank you so much for joining. We've been doing this for a while. I'm a little disappointed that it took me this long to get you on the podcast, but thank you. And I hope we can do it again because like I said, I've said this before, I'm very fortunate at this company to have a lot of finance subject matter experts, former finance people. And from day one, I've been working on content here for like almost 2.5 years. And from very early on, you've always been very good at bearing with me, explaining things that I clearly have no experience in or understanding of. So appreciate you taking the time doing that for other people, not just me for once. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Honored to be on the podcast finally.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.